Chapter 2. The Road West. The next morning Hamish rose early. He made his way down to the stables, just as the sky was touched with the light of dawn. It was cool, and there was a bite to the wind. He checked on his 2 draft horses, Spring and Autumn. They were both bright-eyed. Ogrim, a charger of dappled grey, gave a happy neigh when he saw the man. Hamish reached into Ogrim's stall and stretched all the way up to scratch behind Ogrim's ear. At 17 hands, Ogrim was tall and smart, and he was Ham's best friend. "Missed the fight yesterday, O," Hamish whispered. The large horse blinked at him and stomped an iron-clad hoof. Hamish led Ogrim from the stall and tied him to a nearby stump with a long lead. Ogrim sniffed the air and began to graze on the sweet grass that grew in long tufts. Hamish then woke the young stable hand and tossed him a copper sparrow. The boy rubbed his eyes, recognized Hamish, bit the coin, and clambered to his feet. Hamish pointed his chin at the draft horses. The boy scratched his head and nodded. Finally, Hamish went back outside to where his fen wagon was parked in the stable yard. The fen wagon, the equivalent of a cottage on wheels, was a home away from home to Hamish and the brothers, and occasionally Zaldivar and Sparrow. It was cramped and brimming with gear. It smelled like one might expect. Therefore, the men would almost always choose to sleep outside of it, save for in the worst weather. It was covered in elaborately carved wood that was old and weathered, and was painted garishly in faded green, red, and gold. Boxes and sacks were strapped to the roof, and the sides were lined with locked cabinets filled with weapons and equipment. Hamish twisted his key in the heavy lock on the back door and gathered his cooking and fire kit, which he assembled in short order outside of the wagon. He gathered a bit of dry wood from the nearby trees and kindled a fire. From the innkeep he purchased chicken eggs, thick bacon, and a loaf of hearty rye bread, and an assortment of other sundries for the road. Just as tendrils of aroma began to rise from the cooking food, the stable hand led Spring and Autumn out, tacked and ready to pull. He helped Hamish harness them to the wagon, and eyed the bacon before wandering back into the stable. By the time Hamish's comrades had each made their way down from the inn and gotten a plate of food, Vagelin and the other woman, Hild, were at the stable too. Vagelin saddled her horse, a pinto ambler, and Hild leaned coolly on the tall trunk of a nearby pine. Vagelin cantered up to the men, where they sat around Hamish's dwindling fire, finishing their breakfasts. "Well then," she flashed the men a grin that caught Hamish off guard, and proclaimed, "Shall we be off?" Hamish stood and offered her a light bow. "Ready when you are, milady." Vagelin, atop her ambler, led the party off, and Hild walked beside her. Following them, Hamish sat up high in the driver's seat of his wagon, flanked by Bone and Brune, who strode afoot. Tied by a lead at the back of the wagon was Hamish's grey charger, Ogrim. The rear of the train was taken up by Sparrow, riding his black destrier, and Zaldivar, who rode his shorter sable rouncey. The road was smooth, and the weather was pleasant enough. Soon Burhan was miles behind them. They travelled through the day, and only when the sun's rays began to scrape the tops of the mountains in the west did they stop. Vagelin drew to a halt and turned in her saddle. "We will set camp here and reach Greybook by midday on the morrow." A circle of fire-blackened stones was at the center of a glen off to the left of the road. The earth was covered in soft pine needles and void of rock or root. "A fine spot," Sparrow observed as he dismounted and began to unstrap his destrier Gelf from its armor. "A fine steed," said a deep yet feminine, subtly accented voice from behind him. Hild looked over the tall horse and patted his black withers. "This is a knight's horse, a real destrier, no?" Her pale blue eyes sparkled in one of the diminishing slivers of sunlight. Sparrow hesitated for a breath, trying to figure out if she were challenging him or simply curious. He studied her with his own dark brown, nearly red eyes. "Gelf is of the king's stock, yes. You've got quite the eye," he offered. He noted that her fair skin and hair juxtaposed his own dusky features in a way that complemented while contrasting. Her complexion was at the other end of the spectrum from his own, placing Hamish and the rest somewhere in the middle. It was nice to have another outlier, he felt. "So then," long blonde hair in many tight braids fell from her steel pauldron's shoulder as she looked down to meet his eyes. "Forgive me, sir, but what is a swan blade doing in the service of a sellsword?" He unbuckled the saddle and drew it off. He paused. Perhaps some other time, all right? Fair enough, sir. She nodded, and he could see the muscles of her neck stand out with emotion. Sparrow said, And see here, no need for the formality. I am Sparrow, that is all. And I am Hild Silveyar. She clasped his outstretched hand, offered a slight but polite bow, which he returned. As she turned to leave him to his work, Zaldivar appeared. And I, Zaldivar bowed elaborately, am Zaldivar Estoive. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, milady. She simply kept walking, smiled genially at Zaldivar, and roughly patted his shoulder as she passed. Sparrow, stifling laughter, said, Oh, Zaldivar. Later, Brune and Zaldivar went into the woods armed with bows and high hopes of having venison for dinner. Bowen lay with his back to an ash tree and watched the fire they had kindled. Hamish and Sparrow were finishing preparations on their camp, and Vagelin was scrawling onto a parchment as the last of the light disappeared from the sky. By the time the sky had grown truly dark, Brune and Zaldivar had returned. They were all sitting around the fire pit, where orange flames blazed and 4 rabbits sizzled on spits. Brune was vocalizing an old melody with no words, accompanied by Hamish, who had produced a lute from one of the shelves on the wagon. They passed a bottle of harsh black whiskey around the fire, and to some of the men's surprise, even Vagelin partook, though she did frown at the taste of it. After the rabbits were eaten, Bowen and Sparrow volunteered to gather more firewood. Brune and Zaldivar were dozing off. Vagelin and Hild were readying their sleeping arrangements, and Hamish was tending the crackling fire. Soon Bowen and Sparrow hurried back. They were wide-eyed and not carrying much wood. That's barely enough to get through the night, gents, Hamish said, as the men dropped their load beside the fire. Bowen glanced out into the night, and Sparrow spoke. There's something out there, more than one. Neither man took their eyes from the dark woods for long. We didn't get very far, couldn't see them, but we heard them. Wolpertinger, Brune suggested without looking away from the fire. Squirrels, Zaldivar proposed, even as his eyes were shutting. No, said Bowen as he took long, slow strides around the ring of firelight, peering off past the trees. He stopped by his gear and took up his axe. I'd say wolves, but didn't move like wolves, didn't feel like wolves. Hamish and Brune armed themselves, and Sparrow was never found without at least one of his twin swords. Hild stood ready to pull her great sword from where it lay. Vagelin sat up from her bedroll and rested her hand on a small case made of leather and wood. Zaldivar wasn't convinced. We are barely out of the dukedom, on a king's road. There are no bugbear here, and wolves won't risk a group as big as ours. He said all of this from where he lay, clearly not desiring to rouse himself. Sparrow declared, These are not wolves. He made a thin line of his mouth, and he stood with his back to the fire. Mirelings, said Vagelin in a hushed tone. What's that? Demanded Hamish from across the fire. Mirelings, she repeated louder, and this isn't the King's Road. Zaldivar was getting up now too. There shouldn't be Fae this far north this time of year, he said, and tilted his head, listening carefully. It's the hot springs, she explained. There's an ancient aquifer. On years after a good harvest, they follow it north, raiding outlying farmsteads. The old Duke would send hunters to clear the nests. They never really did much good. But now that the old Duke is dead, and the young Duke doesn't seem to pay much heed to my father's petitions. As her last words were spoken, a long, trilling call echoed from the forest. Everyone froze where they sat or stood. Another similar cry resounded from the other side of their camp. It's Mirelings, Zaldivar concluded flatly. Hamish shouted, Everyone arm yourselves, form a circle, backs to the fire. Suddenly they were all standing, and staring out as their own shadows danced across the tree trunks, steel weapons glinting in the firelight. After the sound of their own movements faded, the silence crowded them in toward the snap-pop of the burning wood. Hamish said, Zaldivar, a light? Zaldivar reached beneath his crow-feather cloak and produced a small item, not unlike a walnut in appearance. He hurled it into the dark woods, and when it crashed against a tree, a sudden burst of brilliant white light cascaded out like a flash of lightning. For the instant the light lasted, no less than 5 figures could be seen crouched, silhouetted among the tree trunks, short, squat beings, with over-wide midsections and spindle arms and legs. Some of them bore clubs and spears. After the flash faded, the sound of the creatures scurrying echoed through the underbrush. On the other side of the fire, Hild hefted the full weight of her 5.5 feet of great sword with one hand. With her other hand she stretched down to the edge of the fire and took up a burning stick, then spun it away into the shadows. The firebrand had much the same effect as Zaldivar's concoction, lighting several of the malformed, diminutive creatures in fiery orange. They shied from the light and scuttered away. "Mylings won't attack outside of their lair unless by ambush," Zaldivar advised. Ham said, "We'll assign a 2-man watch and keep the fire stoked." Vagelin was concerned. "What of the horses?" Sparrow responded, "If anything troubles them, Gelf and Ogrim will break their tethers and defend the rest. I'll take the first watch." "And I," Hild supplemented. "Fine," said Hamish. "Brune and Bowen second watch, then Zaldivar and myself." Hild gave Hamish a nod, and Zaldivar drew a deep breath and stared into the fire for a long moment. "What of me?" asked Vagelin, settling down onto her bedroll. Hamish looked at her for a few heartbeats. "Try to get some rest." As he uttered the words, somewhere off in the darkness the sound of trees snapping burst through the night. "That's no Myrling," breathed Hamish. Louder, he commanded. "Everyone stays in position." "Something else is out there with those bog folk," Brune whispered. "Judging by the sound of it, something very large." For what seemed an eternity, they all listened to the rapid thumping of their hearts beating in their chests. "There is a powerful enemy at hand," whispered Zaldivar. He drew forth a dagger in one hand, and another of the light-giving walnuts in his other. The crash of splintering boughs resounded again, and something partly obscured by trees and darkness moved. Shadowy undulations appeared, heavily scaled and the color of sun-bleached bone, only to dematerialize a moment later. The unclear sight indicated a roughly serpentine form, tall as a horse. Its alabaster girth seemed only to be visible temporarily and in fractions. For a moment, fist-sized crimson eyes flashed with a deathly glow. "St. Cuchulainn," Sparrow swore. "A devil," explained Hild. Just then a deep, booming chuckle emanated from the woods. "No need to flatter." The thunderous cracking of another tree echoed through the night, and the voice continued. "Imagine our delight," boomed the voice, "at finding a highborn and a sorcerer, like fruit from the vine. What words will we learn from thee, conjurer?" "You're mistaken," Hamish yelled back. "No spellcaster in my band." Excitement made his breath and words come fast. "Probably you should just go then, yes?" He looked at Vagelin. An overconfident smile crossed his face. He winked. Vagelin, clutching her wooden box to her chest, responded with a look of terror and a vigorous shake of the head. "A little desperate, Ham?" whispered Bowen. Foot-length claws appeared, clenched into the earth, and the thunderous laughter returned. "This night my minions dine on horseflesh, while I savour a more sweet supper." There was a loud crash as something huge and white smashed from the trees, ramming bull-like through the company. As it passed, each of them was hurled to the ground, and the fire was scattered in a myriad directions. Hamish stumbled to his knees. The fire was spread across the forest floor, little more than embers and a few flickering sticks. Without the firelight, he could barely see. He could hear the beast crashing off to his left, presumably turning for another rush. Myrlings chirped and whooped close by, too close. A shadow appeared before him, and he pulled back his sword ready to strike, but a hand came to rest on his shoulder, and Brune's bearded face materialized in the dim light. Brune pulled Hamish up to his feet. "Form up! On me!" Hamish shouted, and heard at least a dozen feet shuffling in the dark. "This is not going well, Ham!" yelled Sparrow from somewhere further off. Zaldivar came up nearly running into them and moaned, "I think I've broken a rib." "Zaldivar, get something on this blade." "Felbane might work," Zaldivar said, and he fumbled through the pockets of his robe. He pulled out an odorous leafy herb, crushed it to a pulp in his hand, and gently wiped it along Hamish's blade. Brune offered the head of his hammer, and Zaldivar smeared some of the crushed plant onto its surface. "Now for some light," he said, and reached back into his robe. Before Zaldivar could take action, a voice called out in the night, commanding, feminine, and primed with power. She sang in high archaic. The ancient words of power reverberated, and suddenly a luminous mist poured up out of the ground, lighting their surroundings. Vagelin stood tall, parchment in her hand, singing out the ancient syllables. Hamish saw Bowen and Hild flanking her. Sparrow, to the left, and farther from them, engaged with the Myrlings, who were now everywhere among them. In the foggy light of vague spell, the warriors fought their way towards her. Myrlings ran in and out of the light, joustling with spears and pummeling with clubs. Their short stature made them difficult targets. After several misses, Hild caught two monsters with a fast swing of her greatsword, severing both clean in half at the torso. Just as the party regrouped, Rowan yelled, "Look!" The serpentine monster appeared, slowly walking into the foglit area. Even in the light it was hard to see. Its bone-white scales seemed to have mirror-like quality. It took long, flanking steps. The mirelings, for some reason, were falling back. "Brune, with me," Hamish spoke in a low, calm tone. "Ours are the only alchemed weapons. The rest of you, on defense. Zaldivar, coat their weapons with something else if this doesn't work." "If this doesn't work, we'll be dead, you and I," Brune said to Hamish. "Live by the sword, eh?" Hamish grinned. Brune issued a low chuckle, and he leveled his great hammer. "By the hammer." The thing's long snout and rows of finger-length dagger teeth flashed. Its red eyes opened wide. A cacophonous roar emitted from its gullet, and it charged. Hamish screamed a battle cry and matched that charge, and Brune was right on his heel. The monster opened its already gaping maw even wider and twisted its neck, making ready to snatch the warrior up in its teeth. Just at the last moment, Hamish sidestepped deftly and brought his blade around in a horizontal arc. The herb-coated steel rattled against the beast's teeth and sliced a thin line down its jaw. The poultice had a caustic effect, and the monster's flesh withered around the wound. It reared, roared terribly, and Brune's hammer caught it in the chin with a powerful upsweep. The monster reeled and spun. Hamish somersaulted away, but as it turned, it brought its tail about and whiplashed Brune in his plate armor chest piece. There was an ear-shattering sound like the tolling of a great bell, and for a moment Brune was airborne before he came crashing down to land in a heap. The beast, in pain and sensing it had underestimated them, bolted back into the night. The mirelings had already fled. Hours later, the group of mirelings hurried through the forest as the sky lightened. Their oddly shaped small bodies passed through thick underbrush, rustling the leaves. Though small, they were altogether inexhaustible, and the leagues passed quickly as they sped toward their destination. Though fast, they were not as fast as the beast who led them on their attack that night. In the light of dawn, the pale beast trampled the forest floor, galloping on 4 taloned feet. Soon it crept out on a rocky escarpment and wound its way snakily to the base, where in a bog bordered by thorns and dead trees there was the hidden, mossy entrance to a natural cave. The fresh wound in the monster's jaw pained it, and the poultice left a horrid taste. Slowing to a walk, it entered the cave. Sulphurous fumes and tepid air hovered near the entrance, and dead rodents littered the floor. But that bothered the monster not. It slinked into the cave and down deep into the ground through dark and winding tunnels. Eventually, it emerged from the confines of those labyrinthine passages into a vast cavern. The floor of the great space sank away beneath the waveless surface of a subterranean lake. The waters were viscous, perfectly still, and utterly black. The far side of the body of water was lost in the darkness, yet there was a singular point of light out in the middle of the lake. A ghastly azure flame flickered. Suspended in the phantasmal flame, a lurid skull hovered. Its jaw hung slack, its eye sockets dark. When the beast entered, the jaw snapped closed with a click. The flaming skull came towards the shore, floating just above the surface of the lake, leaving little ripples in the liquid and casting blue reflections as it passed. "How now?" the skull said to the white-scaled monster. "How fares Notwan the basilisk?"
"Oh, woe!" lamented Notwan. "This day doth set the tone for ill omens."
Its booming voice echoed around the spacious cavern and juxtaposed the higher-pitched, crackling voice of the skull.
"Do tell,"
spoke the skull of flames.
"Tell thy master of thy plight, and balm thyself in my lake. I note thine injury."
Notwan sighed deeply as it slipped beneath the glossy surface. Its wound fizzled at the black waters.
"An encanter wench of a royal, and an unusual band of fighters. I smelled her noble blood and her aura of magics. Sought to capture them, did I, for thy pleasure, of course."
At that the fiery skull clicked its macabre jaw again, and its blue flames flickered bright. Its empty eyes were unreadable.
"Whose pleasure was it drove thee to make meal of the Lord of Greybrook?"
"Great one, 'twas a necessary transgression. Not one only wished to regain the mortal tongue, so long ago forsaken by my kin."
The skull's eyes glowed brightly for a moment. Inky tendrils formed out of the thick, dark water and wound around Notwan. They clung to the basilisk, who yelped in discomfort.
"Was not my promise of power enough? Perhaps thou art undeserving of such a measure of my dominion." "Perhaps," pondered the skull, "I should grind thee to dust."
"Master,"
gasped Notwan, writhing in the clutches of the dark tendrils.
The lordling was the heir of Greybrook.
The tendrils ceased their squeezing, yet the basilisk struggled to speak.
The warriors who guarded her had steeped their blades with magications.
The tendrils evaporated into ash, fell away, and disappeared into the inky water. Not one sucked in a deep breath and pulled its lengthy body out of the lake, its wound mostly healed and fizzling slightly.
Thy smell as much as thy hide. Must have been great company, forsooth, to strike such a blow on mighty Not One.
It clicked its jaw.
No ill omen this, spoke the skull. Go back and find them. I'll have those roosters' horns. By the everlasting darkness Not One shall.
Not One offered and stretched out to its full length.
Thou shalt indeed, and for this task a boon may be granted. Thou seemst to envy the ways of men so much.
Not One paused, unsure, for it was ever the will of evil skulls to speak in riddles and untruths.
Go ye, step back into the waters,
ordered the glaring skull. Gray mist coalesced, knee-high and cool, covering the road. The fen wagon bumped its way over the hard-packed dirt. With each thud, Brune groaned. He rode alongside Hamish, up on the driver's bench. Over his shoulders was a crochet quilt. Beneath his tunic could be seen white linen bandages, and beneath that, his entire chest was covered by one massive black and purple bruise. So she's a sorceress, Hamish yawned. The early beams of sunlight were just reaching out, peeking up over the eastern horizon, and casting patches of fog and gold. Brune didn't reply. He only winced as another unseen rock in the road bumped a wheel. She's a sorceress, and there are monsters within a day of Cragganmore, Hamish continued. Seems our young duke is not the vigilant master his father was. Brune spoke through his pain, his eyes shut, teeth clenched, and voice low.
That surprises you?
Are you going to be all right? Bowen asked, looking up from where he walked alongside them. Brune opened his eyes enough to glare at Hamish. A low grumble issued from his bearded mouth. You'll be fine, Hamish assured him, and nodded.